Should we, will we, or are we seeing a seismic shift in how we should deliver public education and define student and system successful outcomes? And how does the often bureaucratic and politically entangled world of public education leadership compare with the profit-driven arena of private sector leadership? Those are the questions we're going to be considering today. Welcome back to the Uncommodified Podcast and to another UNCORK conversation. My guest today is Josh Windsor. Josh, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tim. It's nice to be here.
Awesome. Great to have you. Now, let me introduce Josh to you. First of all, full disclosure, Josh is my nephew. He is the oldest son of my second oldest brother, Terry. So full disclosure. But more importantly than that, Josh is an educator and leader with a diverse background spanning education, business, and community development. Josh holds a Master's of Education as well as a B.Ed and a B.A. and is a certified teacher and principal in the province of Ontario in Canada. For those of you who don't live in Canada, listen to the show that is in Canada. Over 15 years of experience Josh has as a school leader. Josh has been both a principal and a vice principal in multiple secondary schools. Josh's professional journey also started his experience beyond education in the business arena. He was in business development, sales, and coaching in his early years before he transitioned into the educational sector. He was a director of sales and marketing at a startup for a software company. He's also a professional rugby head coach at 2 local universities. His commitment to the community is exemplified in his service that he gives as a volunteer, serving as both the president of the Waterloo County Secondary School Athletic Association and the Central Western Ontario Secondary School Athletic Association. He has a wealth of organizational government experience from the variety of community associations that he works on. And most importantly, he's passionate for education, innovation, and has a proven track record of leadership. Josh brings a unique blend of personal experience, professional experience, community engagement, all to our conversation today. And because it's an uncorked conversation, of course, we're going to uncork it with a drink. Now, those of you on the YouTube channel, you're going to notice that Josh is in his office. So probably not a great idea for him to be having a drink of alcohol today. I will, because I'm in my studio. Josh, what are you drinking today?
I've just got some sparkling water, Tim. I'd like to join you in a glass of wine, but we frown upon that at schools.
Yes, fair enough. Well, listen, I'm going to drink for you. I'm going to have a glass of Kilcoman, which is a really nice Isla whiskey. I'm going to have a glass of that. So cheers to you. I'll cheers with my my whiskey, and you can have some sparkling water. Awesome. Josh, listen, every conversation is sparked by a great question. And so I got a question that I want to start this conversation with. Here's where I want to start this. Is there, in your opinion, and from your vantage point, is there a seismic shift happening in how we believe or how we should believe that we should deliver public education and define student success and successful outcomes for the system?
Yeah, I think so, Tim. I mean, that's a big question, so we can break some of that down. I guess the first thing that I would suggest is, our public education system is, what we would normally call a colonial structure. We know that as we started to get into the industrial age, we built schools, and public education came from that. And realistically, it was founded to build workers for things like factories and businesses, right? And so we wanted to educate individuals so that they could go out into the workforce and get involved in the business world. And in our democratic and capitalist society, that's really what we needed. Society has shifted significantly, and it's not that we don't live in that democratic and capitalist society anymore, but the workers that we need are very different. And you would know that from many of the conversations you've had with individuals out there. And so when we think about providing a worker that can get to work on time, can make sure that they can follow a process, understands social situations and social networks, and can be productive without causing issues in a business, right? Those are the kind of people we needed. I mean, even going back 25 years ago. We need different types of workers now, right? We need them to be able to think critically. We need them to have some creativity. They need to be able to be a self-directed learner because there's always movement in technology. They need to be able to collaborate with other people, and there's some citizenships citizenship, literacy, but also digital literacy requirements we have for individuals. And so a high school diploma now is very different than a high school diploma was even 10 or 15 years ago. And so public education systems move slowly, but we do know that there's a significant need for us to provide experiences to students that look very different than they did even 10 or 15 years ago.
Wow. So how do you, like when you look at your journey, you've been in the educational sphere for over 15 years. So even if you look at that last 15 years, how has the definition or marker of success, how is it changing? How do you today sort of decide and look at and grade your success in the lives of your students and in your contribution that you're making to them?
Yeah, I guess I would say our system hasn't shifted that quickly. Right? We're
Interesting.
still using the same report card we used 25 years ago. I mean, we're reporting in a percentage system when we know that proficiency is probably a better sense of what somebody can and is able to do. But even our understanding of how learning works and what's required from the perspective of knowledge has significantly changed. So as you know, you can get on the internet and look at and use Google to pretty much find out any information you want relatively quickly. Provided you have the understanding of what a good source is or not such a good source, right? Because you're going to get competing information in situations. But knowledge used to be something that was really important. So if you could go on Jeopardy, you were a really smart person. We know that you and I can probably type in those questions as fast as anybody on Jeopardy can answer. We can get that information at our fingertips. And so we have to do a much better job, and what we look at around success is what is the difference between information that you truly need to be able to be successful and what is information that you need to be able to access, right? And so I'll give you an example. If you're going to be an engineer, you got to be able to do math, right? It's pretty tough to do high-level math if you can't add and subtract and multiply in your head to a relative degree, right? So we need to teach students those basic skills. Similarly with literacy, from a literacy perspective, you need to have a certain level of literacy to be able to read a manual, for example, if you're going to do some work with a machine or even in any type of business production capacity, right? So we have to have a certain level of literacy. But do we need kids to be writing essays? Because I don't know when the last time you wrote an essay was, but it was probably the last time you were in an education setting.
That's probably true.
Right. And so, I mean, that's part of the difficulty of what we have right now, especially as technology really shifts and changes. When we start to think about artificial intelligence technology, and I know that I can go on ChatGPT and get it to write me any comparative essay I want, and it'll be really good. And I can get that done in about 10 seconds. How am I teaching students to be able to write without those kind of traditional methods of writing? And what are we doing to support them? And then, is that actually success? Do you need to be able to write anymore, right? And so we have to start to think about some of those questions and decide what's important information and knowledge for students to be able to know as they move into a world that's changing constantly. And I mean, you know as well as I do the political situation that we're in, the volatility of things like markets in the business world, just thinking about AI and or even space technology, right? Like things are moving so quickly. How are we to build a curriculum that supports students to be able to transfer skills that they have from here into the real world? And that's really what we're starting to talk about, is transferable skills.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when you think about it, I mean, I think when I go back, I graduated high school in the early 1980s, so a long time ago. And the reality is that even probably in the last 10 years, it's a shift between, I got rewarded for being certain about the right answer, whatever that meant. And now we are being encouraged and we're being challenged that actually uncertainty and ambiguity is a big part of understanding ourselves and our future. And so these two things really war against each other because we sort of reward people and they get a check mark and a star for answering with certainty about something, but yet there is a less certainty today in the world than there clearly was in the past.
Well, and it's really interesting if you look at something like the Harvard study, which was a longitudinal study that was done with Harvard graduates, and they followed them. I don't know if they're past their 80s now, but these were individuals that were highly successful coming out of university at one of the most prestigious universities in the world. And when they followed these individuals, what they found was very few of them moved past a middle management position. And part of that, and one thing we know about success in education is you learn to play that game.
Yeah.
Right? So if I'm a pleaser and I'm going to follow all of your rules and I'm going to be able to conform socially to the constructs that you provide for me, then I'm going to be successful in school. But what translates into success in the real world? Lots of times that's other things like creativity, entrepreneurship, questioning your teacher, right? Questioning the people that are saying this is the knowledge that you need and it's correct and right? So our 19th century model of education was focused on that knowledge acquisition. We siloed and compartmentalized information, right, by sectioning things like discipline. So science was not the same as math, for example, and it doesn't support feedback. It doesn't support the skills and competencies our students will need to be successful as they look towards jobs that don't even exist at this moment, right?
Right.
And they have to be able to navigate that ever-changing society, right? There's a complexity there. It's unpredictable. We're trying to prepare them for rapidly changing political, social, economic, technological, and environmental landscapes. And that's really challenging. So what does success look like? Because that was your original question.
Yeah.
To me, success looks like happiness,
Yeah.
right? I'm helping kids achieve their goals.
Yeah.
And when we do that and when we support them through that and we remove barriers like failure in a macro-credential setting, so you need 32 credits to graduate in the Ontario system, right? A kid that doesn't get a credit, that's a big deal, right? That sets them back quite a bit. And so how do I put wraparound services and supports in place to help that kid that really needs to learn that lesson but can do it in this time-bound system, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. And listen, if you're listening, and one of the things I want to let you in on a bit of a secret. So in preparation for doing this podcast, Josh invited me to come to his school where he's a principal, and I spent about an hour and a half with Josh about a month and a half ago, and it was transformative for me. I mean, first of all, seeing the environment, the number of kids. I think you got like 1,700 kids or something.
Yeah, 1550 bodies.
1550 in your bodies in your school, so a lot of kids. And the fact you're walking down the hall and you knew every kid you addressed, every teenager you addressed, you knew their name. You're walking down the hall. You've created a really awesome environment, Josh. And I want to acknowledge that because it was really powerful for me, and I appreciated you inviting me into your world. We were meeting, a complex situation came up with one of the students. I was able to watch how you navigated that with that student and the complexities of that. I think the day I was there, both of your vice principals were off. You were like this one-arm wallpaper hanger making it all happen. And I just really appreciated being brought into that world. And one of the things you and I talked about is some of the work that you're involved with the university and other thinking you've done around 21st century learning competencies and this idea, which was new to me, of this idea of micro-credentialing. So can you help us understand a little bit about what these 21st century learning competencies are looking like or shouldn't be looking like in the discussion? And what is this idea of micro-credentialing, and how potentially do you see it being a positive impact as in the evolution of the education system?
So just to give you a little bit of history on kind of visioning that's occurred around what we're calling now transferable skills. So we've moved from 21st century learning competencies. We then started to call them global skills, and now the language is transferable skills. And it's one of the difficulties with research and education. You have to come up with a new term for something to write a book. So,
fair enough.
In about 2016, the Council of Ministers for the Ministers of Education for the provinces in Canada kind of got together, and they set out these kind of 21st century learning competencies that they felt, based on research that they had, some from business world and the political world, and obviously in the education system, What are the things that kids need to know and be able to do in order to be successful as they move forward into this kind of unknown possibility that we've talked about, right? So there's various iterations of these things, but they all kind of follow very similar lines. So in Ontario, they call these transferable skills as critical thinking and problem solving, innovation, creativity, and entrepreneurship, the capacity to be a self-directed learner, collaboration, communication, global citizenship, sustainability, and digital leadership, right? And so that's kind of the Ontario language. There's across the G20, you're seeing very similar, I guess I would say, theoretical belief that these are the things that people need in order to be successful as they move forward. The University of Waterloo has done some really good research, and they have they were one of the first co-op systems in the world, and so they have years and years of experience with employing their students into businesses. So that co-op program has been extremely successful, and they've come up with what they call the future ready talent framework. So again, just different language, but they talk about, discipline and context specific skills. They talk about critical thinking. They talk about problem solving, collaboration. So you see these words are coming kind of over and over again. They also talk about intercultural effectiveness, so being able to navigate between different cultures. And I mean, I know you've traveled a lot. You would know what that feels like to be able to navigate in and out of different cultures, right? And so as you look at research kind of across the world, these are the things that they're saying. You got to have some of these things to be highly successful, and you have to be able to have, at least a limited understanding in order to be in a position to be a contributing member of society. And so that's what we're trying to do in schools. But if we break that down into something like creativity, like how do you teach creativity, right? And not understanding all the brain research that's out there, and recognizing that we really don't know how the human brain works, right? We've got some theories about learning, and I mean, personally, I'm a constructivist, so I feel like knowledge is built on top of other knowledge. But if we talk about that transferability and what it takes to look at a completely new or different situation and go, hey, I can pull from something over here and that makes some sense to me. That's really where innovation occurs, right? So if you think about somebody that researches vision, for example, and the biology of the eye, they're very good at, and then they have a conversation with somebody who is a biologist that is looking at like why an iguana can change colors, and then all of a sudden they start talking, and some of the things they're talking about are similar, and then they're like, hey, this is a research project, let's look into this, right? I mean, that's transference of information to a different context, and that's really where creativity starts to kind of feel like it's real.
It's interesting. And as you described that, you talked about a very linear, a very siloed sort of way of looking at things. I go to math class, I go to science class, I go to I go to geography class, whatever it is now. This is the things we called them when I went to school. Maybe different
Yes.
now.
No, we still call them that.
There you go. But the reality is they're very siloed, and they're down these verticals. What I hear you talking about actually is this sort of almost a matrix way of looking at it, where we're talking about teaching creativity, and then it could be applied within these verticals. So it seems like a very different way of starting to frame and look at this core skill set required, and then how it can be applied within these different disciplines.
Yeah, and I would say I would prefer for us to start thinking about clusters of knowledge as opposed to disciplines. I think we need to broaden that out a little bit, right? So anything that I want to learn or teach is a pathway into something else, right?
Yep.
So if we think about math as an example, we know that if you're looking at any type of data, whether it's big data or smaller data, math is everywhere. It doesn't matter what you do. Now, you're not necessarily doing calculus in all of those situations, but there is a certain level of math you need to understand to look at any type of data, right? And then similarly, if you're going to move into another context, there's that data application to almost everything that we look at, right? And we know that everything that we teach and learn has another context or another iteration, or it's connected to something else. And
Yes.
so we look at things kind of in these silos, but realistically, that's not how we should be teaching, and it's definitely not how we learn.
No, no, and that may be part of the problem, because the very skills that you're talking about as a business consultant, in my career, I mean, these are the skills that, frankly, every business needs, and it is difficult for them to teach it. And so, just like years ago, people needed to graduate with certain subset of skills that they could get to get a job. These critical thinking skills, these innovative skills, this ability to embrace ambiguity, these core skills are the new commodity in the world that they're going to go into.
Well, and your first question was about micro-credentialing, right? Like, what does that look like? And I would say we live in a society where we have macro credentials, right? And I've got 3 degrees from
Right.
universities. That's a macro credential. But learning experiences happen in much smaller chunks. And so where my vision is from a high school perspective is I have that course, that siloed math class, but every one of my students has learning experiences outside of that environment. So if you think about things like extracurricular activities as a good example, right? If you think about the jobs that they work part-time or the other experiences that they have as a volunteer, every one of those experiences is a learning opportunity. And so when I look at micro-credentialing, what I would like to do is build a program, and I've got a structure for it, where a student can reflect on any learning experience and then work towards a larger credential by using all of those smaller experiences to build that portfolio, right? And if you think about what that looks like for an individual, it's as if I'm building their resume for them. So, I've got a kid who's the captain of the basketball team and is in a leadership class, and then goes out and is like a shift manager at their job at McDonald's, but also plays on a community team and does some volunteer work, right? All of those are leadership opportunities.
Right.
And should that student not be able to then cluster those things, credential them, and say, from an educational perspective, as a public education system, those things all have value.
Yes, 100%. So you're envisioning a world where people would potentially graduate with this macro thing called a high school diploma in this case, or whatever that looks like, but actually what would be the thing that fed that and gave it life would be a subset of clusters of skill and ability and interest cluster sort of coming together, and those actually not just being sort of tacitly seen in the background, but actively acknowledged and be part of what would be encouraged and presented.
Absolutely.
Huh.
And I mean, one of the biggest difficulties with adolescent education is engagement, right? So kids come to school because they have to.
Right.
You can ask pretty much any teenager whether they want to go to school every day. They're going to tell you no. And so the ones that tell you they want to come to school, it's not because they want to go into their classes, right? It's because that's where their friends are. So we know that the socialization process of a school is really important. But when they're here, we need to get them excited about the learning that they're doing, and creating a process for them to relate all of the learning that they're doing into their education, then allows them to see value in what they're doing. Part of what we're trying to do here with respect to kind of learning opportunities is we use the Global Sustainable Development Goals, which were developed by the United Nations. So things like clean air, clean water, education for all, women, and so you can go and look at those Global Sustainable Development Goals that they're trying to reach by 2030. Now they're pretty higher arching goals, right? But when we enter curriculum through a problem and we have kids work to solve that problem on a community level, they see what they're doing as valuable. So an example of that is we have a civics classes, grade 10 kids all have to take civics class. And so one of my teachers started to look at the Global Sustainable Development Goals and have kids just come up with a problem in the community. And one of our groups of students decided that they felt my school is in Kitchener, Ontario, and the road that we're on is Indian Road. And when the school was built, our nickname was the Renegades. We had what would be indigenous iconography that was cultural appropriation that was being used as our mascot vision of what the school is, right? That was removed quite a while ago, but we still are situated on Indian Road. And so that's my address. So we had some kids that decided that wasn't okay. They reached out to our mayor through social media, and then they built a campaign. They became a delegation at City Hall, and they had it passed through City Council that they're going to change the name of our road.
Wow.
Which is engagement beyond what you would see for most kids. And I mean, that's a very high level example, but I've got kids who have decided they want to help the neighbors in our community, so they go rake lawns. They just take out flyers, right? And so they kind of come up with a problem and then they try to solve it.
It's amazing and it's interesting because when I train in corporate settings, I fight against the same problem where there's this idea that people think it's all about attendance, so if we get attendance, if we get asses in chairs, then, it's successful somehow. And I always say to the people I work with and the leaders I work with, look, attendance is meaningless. It's application of the concepts or ideas that we are exploring, which is the goal. So you're actually taking a very similar approach, which you're saying, look, attendance and just sort of checking the box of a subset of, quote, measurable intellectual sort of standards is one thing, but it's not the key thing. It's actually application of that knowledge into the real world that these students live in. And that's where that learning becomes impregnated with superpower for them.
Absolutely. Like if you want to teach a kid about politics, they can write a multiple choice test on politics, but when they actually become a delegation,
that's right, in
your municipality and take action and have something done, that's a lifelong experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me ask you, you obviously are dealing with students, but you're dealing with parents, and that is a complex world these days. With the way that families are structured today, years ago when I went to high school, most people had two parents, and now people have often more than two parents in their sphere. It's a complicated environment. What's the best advice that you have for parental partners to your students at your school? Maybe for me as a grandparent, now I don't get kids at school anymore, but my grandkids are in school. What's the best advice that you could give to me or you would give to a parent to say, how do you support this sort of new way of looking at the world and at education?
The first thing I would say is don't buy them a cell phone until they're at least 15.
There you go.
And I say that kind of jokingly, but not really. We have moved towards removing cell phones from the classroom. There's a ton of research, and I'm actually working with a doctor. I'm going on another podcast in a few weeks about this because she's worked with me and spoken to parents, and we are really trying to get cell phone use out of our classrooms because it takes time and attention away from learning tasks. And all of the research out there shows that if you're distracted,
yep,
you're not able to get into deep learning or thinking, right? And so, no. That buzz and whir that's happening consistently. So that would be the first thing I would say. And for every kid that tells you they're going to be made fun of because they don't have one, they're wrong. We have kids all over the place that don't have them. We give them a Chromebook when they show up here at grade 9. It's theirs for the time that they're here at school. They have a digital device. But when we talk about how to support adolescents, I think it's really important that people recognize and understand that their kids are going to, first of all, start with peer relationships, and that's going to be the most important thing to them. It just is.
Yeah.
It always was for us, and if you think back of when you were a teenager, right, your friends were way more important than your family. But it's continuing to instill those family values, the differences between right and wrong, the capacity to stand up in situations where you're seeing something that's wrong, holding your integrity as more important than other things, right? And just making sure that you're supportive, but you're not solving everything for kids, right? It's actually really important for children to learn to solve their own problems, right?
Yeah.
And so if you think about kind of back when you and I were a kid, where our parents may not even have been on the playground with us because they just said, get out of the house,
Yeah.
right? We would do things that were probably close to dangerous at times, right?
Yeah.
Well, what you see now if you go to a playground is as soon as a kid tries to take a chance, like let's say monkey bars, they're going to climb the monkey bars upside down, and the parent starts to get worried, the parent tells them to stop, right? But that kid's never taken a risk or a chance, and the reality is they might fall and get a little bit hurt. But if they don't ever take risk and solve their own problems and take chances, then what you're doing is you're putting them in a situation where they have zero resilience. So our education system is set up so that from kindergarten to grade 8, you basically move forward age appropriate, right? We don't fail kids anymore. And you'll move forward age appropriate. They'll modify curriculum so you can be in grade 8 and be doing grade 4 work, but you're still staying with your peer group. As soon as they come into grade 9, we're in a credit bearing system, and you kind of have to meet the standard. And for some kids, that's the first time they've ever experienced any type of failure, right? So there's very little resilience. And because they've never had hardship, they don't even know that it's coming, right? So that's something that we really stress with people. And of course, parents are really busy too, right? And it's not like your teenager comes home and says, when you say, hey, how was school today? They kind of grunt, or they say, yeah, it was fine, right? That's what you get.
Yeah.
And so communicating with teachers and other individuals at schools is really important, just to stay abreast of what's going on, and recognizing that your child probably needs some support, but they also need you to let them solve some of their own problems. So when I talk to parents, I talk about self-advocacy skills for kids, right? And the talk I use is like, your kid's in grade 9 right now, they're 14. It's 4 very short years until they're an adult. And when they become an adult, in order for me to talk to you, they have to sign a paper that says I can. And they'll likely still be here in high school. So when that kid's in 4th or 5th year here and signing themselves out every day because they don't like to go to school and you don't know about it, and then all of a sudden they don't get into the university program that you wanted them to get into, or they felt they wanted to get into, right? Those are the natural consequences of not having that engagement and helping students build those self-advocacy skills that they need to be successful throughout life, right? So we talk about sometimes the helicopter or the bulldozer parent, right?
Yep.
Those are the ones that are going to get what they want in the moment, but in the end, their kid is going to suffer, because realistically, most of the time, the problems that they're trying to solve are minor. Now, I'm not talking about significant issues like parents that have had to battle for special education services, or like those are things that parents sometimes need to do, and our systems are not perfect. I'm talking about the minor stuff.
Yeah. Well, and it's a good point, because even in adults that I see in my work in business, I mean, the number one challenge is the ability to solve problems on their own, frankly, and not being victimized by problems. And the second is being able to have difficult and challenging conversations, being able to self-advocate, being able to stand up in a room and say, I have a contrary opinion. These are things that adults struggle with, and I think part of it is the very thing we said, is that we've parented people in a certain way. Our systems are designed in a certain way, and we all have to challenge ourselves. And again, if you're listening in, just challenge yourself. Again, how are you contributing to some of these problems, and how are you actually counteracting them? Because at the end of the day, these problems are being created by the sum of our actions, behaviors, and attitudes. And you know, Josh, as a principal, is pointing out some of the challenges that he deals with. Josh, listen, as we sort of bring the conversation around, and we'll finish in maybe 5-10 minutes, I've got a question. So help me understand the connection between your worlds. You came out of a business world, you came into an education world. I'd like to understand, so when you look at leadership in the sector you lead in now, which is complicated. I mean, the day I was there, watching how you have to lead in this it's a very complex world that you lead in. Then you look at private sector leadership. So how are they different, and how are they the same? And how do you see that?
Yeah, I would say one of the key differences between kind of private sector, and I'll say public sector because some other public sector areas would be similar in complexity.
Yeah.
You have so many stakeholders when you're trying to solve a problem. So it's probably easiest for me to explain this with an example. So I have two students that have a difficulty, right? I put 1,500 teenagers in the same building every day, you're gonna have conflict.
Yeah.
And so let's say that one of these individuals is racialized and one of them is, potentially not necessarily, like they're neurotypical. So let's say autism spectrum disorder.
Okay.
And I now have two situations where there are competing human rights in a conflict, right? And so I will have parents on both sides of those things saying, my child has certain rights, right? So, I'm not allowed to discriminate based on race. I'm not allowed to discriminate based on somebody that would be kind of not neurotypical. And so the Human Rights Code there's no hierarchy of rights. I have to try to meet all of those needs. Now, you add the complexity of, I have lots of different legislation to think about and look at, right? So safe schools, the Safe Schools Act would be one. So if there was violence involved in one of those things, I may be involved in a suspension or something beyond that. And now I'm in a situation where I have a parent who's contesting a suspension because their child was just defending themselves, which is a very interesting conversation that we can have at some point in time. But defending yourself in the province of Ontario means trying to get away, and if you can't, you can use physical violence. Or physical. It doesn't mean running at somebody that just hit you and hitting them back, right? Which is what parents seem to think lots of times. That's self-defense, right? And to try to solve that, I could have two sets of parents, as you kind of alluded to earlier, right?
Yeah.
And I could have two sets of parents on the other side. And those parents don't necessarily agree with each other either, even for what they want for their own child, right? Then we're talking about the public good, we're talking about making sure my school is safe, and we're talking about the greater implications in the community, because if something, actually one of those conflicts happened at the mall down the street, I've got a whole set of other issues and potentially police involvement, right? So you're always kind of wading into these super complex situations where you're dealing with adolescents that they don't have fully formed brains. They don't fully understand things. So when you're a teenager, things are right or things are wrong, right? And sometimes what right and wrong looks like to you is very different depending on your background, right? And your lived experience. And so the way right and wrong looks for one family, with me as kind of the white person with power and privilege, I am enforcing kind of rules that they don't necessarily agree with in the first place, right? But they have to send their kid to school because that's the law. So that's an example of how complex something can get into, and that could just be two kids yelling at each other or pushing.
Yeah. Well, I tell you something, again, if you're listening in and you're a business leader right now, you better be thanking your lucky stars that you don't have to deal with the stuff that Josh deals with on a regular basis. Could you imagine? Again, you got customer stakeholders, of course, you got internal stakeholders in a business. But again, you don't have the complexity of what you just described when you're dealing with a workplace conflict, although it can tip into the same kind of challenges as it relates to human rights. The reality is you don't have the complexity of also a parental influence beyond that, how that all looks. And I will say that's one thing that, when I was in the school and watching you interact, and you were dealing with some kids who were having some challenges, and just watching how you were dealing with that, I left your school and I sat in my car and thanked my lucky stars I don't have to do what you do all day, Josh, because I don't know if I would have the fortitude to do it. I mean, you have developed tremendous skills and talents to do it. You have a personality that comes at this in a very positive framework. But it's challenging, and again, if you're listening in, one challenge I would have for you is, all of us are so super judgmental, frankly, when we look at the systems around us. We can all do it better, of course, because we know better. I heard this one time, Josh, is sort of a guy described it. He said, it's like going to a baseball game and you're in the crowd and everybody in the crowd can hit better, run faster, and play baseball better than everything. The problem is they can't get their fucking hot dog out of their mouth long enough to play the game, okay? And I think a lot of times we're like that in society. We all look at, I could fix that system. It's so easy. These are complex systems that have tremendous difficulty and challenge, and a lot of people like yourself, Josh, who have great intentions, goodwill, great hearts, want to make it happen, want to make it work for the students and for your stakeholders, And I have just a lot of respect for you, particularly after coming in and watching you in your environment.
I appreciate that. I mean, one of the other key differences, Tim, is around the number of individuals that I oversee on a daily basis. So I know in business you talk about direct reports, and so I have 120 direct reports.
Oh my gosh.
So I deal with 5 different unions or associations with that many different employee groups. And the Education Act says I'm responsible and liable for my school grounds 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. So you can add the complexity of kind of taking care of my facility, making sure all my staff are happy, which is really hard to do in a public education system because we're not allowed to use any public money to make anybody happy. So I can't even buy them a card at a holiday. Well, I can't buy them coffee for a staff meeting because that would be misappropriation of public funds.
Oh my gosh.
Because that's the way the legislation is written. So think about individuals who are dealing with 30 plus teenagers multiple times a day, 3 to 4 hours a day, and then, my boss can't even buy me a coffee.
That's great. That's crazy. Great. And listen, if you're listening again, if you've got students in a school, I hope that you're really understanding the complexity that your principals and vice principals, administrators, your teachers deal with every day on our behalf. They go to bat for us. In Ontario, we have this thing called the Sunshine List for those of you in Ontario, And I think the Sunshine List, Josh, is people who make, $100,000 or more, something ridiculous.
Yes.
Which in today's world is not a lot of money. And then what happens is they publish this list in Ontario and Canada. You may not have this in your jurisdiction if you're listening in. But then everybody goes batshit crazy because, some school administrator, made $110,000. You know what? I think that I look at what some people make that I know in business and I go, you educators ought to be making a heck of a lot more money for the pain and suffering we put people through on a regular basis. So just so you know, I'll go to bat for that any day because I think that's a wise investment in our future because it is investing in the things that we need, which is great citizens. Great communities are made by great citizens, and great people are shaped by the influencers that spend time with them. And during high school and school, it's primarily teachers, Josh.
And I would say people do it because they're passionate.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, one of the other things that occurs in almost every secondary school is things like extracurricular activities. So
right.
Every time one of those teachers is coaching a sports team, running a band, doing a school play, that's all volunteer time.
Wow.
Right? They're doing that on top of their job. They don't get hired for that here in Ontario. I know in some jurisdictions they do hire and they get different remuneration for that. But here in Ontario, those people are just doing those things because they're passionate about them and they want to transfer that passion to the kids that they connect with on a daily basis. And that's what I see from my staff. They're incredibly passionate about learning. They're incredibly passionate about doing what's best for kids, and they're incredibly passionate about a lot of the other interests that they have, and they just want to share that with people all the time. And I don't know that when you go to other places in the world, whether it's a business or not, all of your workers feel that way, and so.
Yeah, no, it's great, and it's a great reminder, Josh, for sure. Listen, as we bring this conversation to a close, we're talking about this idea. My podcast is the Uncommodified podcast. We're talking about uncommodifying education and understanding that we're not just creating a commodity in these students that are coming out. We need a better way of looking at that. But I'm interested to know, Josh, when you walk in a room, when you walk into your school, and you're trying to uncommodify that world. You're trying to come in and you're bringing the thing that only Josh Windsor can bring into that room. How do you see that unique contribution? When you walk into a room of students, what unique contribution are you trying and endeavoring to bring into that situation?
I think the key for me and what has made me successful in any of my roles is the capacity to build relationships, lead from a place of wanting to listen and understand, being humble as a leader. And so I would never use positional authority in any situation. So I tell kids when I get up in front of my grade 9 kids first day of school, I say, you can call me Josh if you want. Right? It's not Mr. Windsor. You decide how you want to speak to me. And just building that relationship with kids starts to build the trust, which is why when I walk around the halls and you see, I know most of the kids.
Yeah.
And they know me, and they listen and we can have conversations. They come to me with problems and issues, and they know that they're going to be heard, and then I'm going to treat them fairly and with respect. And it doesn't matter if it's about one of my staff members. I'm going to treat that kid the same as I would treat that staff member, because I mean, adults make mistakes too, right?
Yeah.
And then we move through solving that problem in a way that supports that kid in learning, what would I do next time to take care of this myself?
Yeah, and Josh, I will say, I mean, that just came loud and clear to me as we walked the halls, and I had the chance to spend some time with you in the school. And you know, I appreciate what you're bringing, what you're challenging yourself. You obviously are extremely bright. You're dedicated. You're passionate, but you're also challenging yourself, not just to sit in the system and just bide your time. And I really, really have a lot of respect for that. And again, if you're listening in, you listened in for a reason. And so again, whether you are in an adult learning environment or a learning environment with children or teenagers, I want to just challenge you with this conversation and ask yourself again, how are you contributing not just to attendance and just checking a box, but actually contributing to an application of ideas that will be for the betterment of people themselves, our communities, and ultimately for our world, because that's how it all adds up at the end of the day. Listen, do me a favor. You listened in for a reason. Hunt me down at tim@uncommodified.com or check us out on social media. Spread the news about this podcast. Send it to your friends, send it to anybody who's got school-aged children, and make sure we're challenging ourselves actually to understand that there is a shift happening, and we have to understand our opportunity to see a brand new generation of people be equipped to provide potential tremendously positive impact in their communities. Thanks for listening in. Have a great day. Cheers.